the book instructed us to measure our hip arc, which is the side seam to the center front and the front, and the side seam to the center back and the back. Know what those hip arc measurements are. There's even a place to write in your measurements on page 44, so you're not constantly going back to page 17. So I would write them in there. If you paid for this book, use it as a tool. If you plan on selling it in the future, just erase, you know, put it in pencil. Okay, so our hip arc, it's going to be hip arc plus 2.5 inches. That 2.5 inches includes all of our extra draping room and seam allowance. You don't have to add any additional, except of course if you want to add a little bit bigger, just for shrinking room and whatever, and mess up room. Okay, so the first thing I normally would do is I would, along the center back edge, measure in 1 inch with my ruler, along that torn edge. And I don't measure from the frayed fluffy part, I measure from the first woven yarn in. Do you see the difference? There's like a 1/2 inch, or sorry, 1/8 of an inch of frayed fluff. Don't measure from the fluff part, measure from the first part that's actually still woven. And I would drop my ruler down onto here, line up the heavy line in the middle, and draw a center back line, okay? Then that gets folded under, and if you've got the really crusty muslin, you can just crease it with your fingernail. You don't need to go back to the iron. You certainly can go back to the iron if you want to, but it really creases quite nicely, okay? Now I'm going to do the same thing with the center front, okay? So I will have a fold on center back, and I'm going to write on here, center back, CB. And I'm going to write on here, center front, CF. Again, this way I'm not going to get confused or mixed up later on. Okay. Now we also have a hip depth measurement. That's from the bottom of the waist tape, and I want to be clear here, we're going to be measuring from the bottom of the tapes, on the waist and on the hip, bottom to bottom. From at center front, bottom of the waist tape to the bottom of the HBL hip tape, we're going to find out what our hip depth is. The front and the back hip depth are usually different, just like the front and the back hip arc are usually different. Often the front is longer because she's got a little abdomen, a little belly sticking up, so they're going to be different measurements. So on mine, my front hip arc is 7 3/4, or sorry, hip depth. And what I'm going to do to locate where this horizontal line goes is I need to find out where my hip depth is along that center front fold, plus I need some draping room at the top. Okay, so the amount of draping room we're going to give is 1 1/4 inches. So I'm going to put a little mark here at 1 1/4 inches. This is going to represent where my center front waist intersection is, and you could even mark it, center front waist. Okay, and then I'm going to measure down further my hip depth, whatever that is. So mine is 7 3/4, and I'm going to write on here, front hip depth, 7 3/4. It'll help you get to know your form. It'll help these measurements start to sink in, because by the end of this term, you're going to know what your hip depth is on your form, and you're never going to want to use a different form because you're going to know her body really well. Okay, so from that 1 1/4 inch mark, so there's a 1 1/4 inch space, I'm measuring down my hip depth, and you use whatever your hip depth is. And notice how I'm using a plastic ruler. I'm not using a tape measure. Tape measures stretch and flex and stuff. This is the ruler that we're going to do most of our measurements with. Okay. Now I need to square a line from this hip depth mark across the muslin. And what that means is I want it to have a 90-degree angle on either side of that line. I don't want it to be tipping down or up. And the way I'm going to do that, I could either use my L square, which has a perfect 90-degree square angle, or I can use my plastic ruler. Either one, whichever one you have handy. I grab whatever is closest to me at the time. But I'll show you this way because often it's what's at hand. I'm going to find one of the finest lines across the whole ruler. One of the skinny ones, not the thick 1-inch lines, like one of the 1/8 inch lines. And I'm going to align that really thin line to the folded edge of my fabric. If I use the thin one, I can be really accurate about placing this straight. If I use a thick one, I could tip it one way or the other and not really know, okay? So if I line up one of these really fine lines with the folded edge of my fabric, okay, and then I draw across, it's going to give me a nice squared line. So her original marking was pretty good. My muslin changed a little bit when I stretched it, but I'm now going to ignore the black line and I'm going to go with the purple line that I just drew in. This guy here and this guy need to be right angles. Okay, so now would be a great time to fix it if they're a little wonky. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do you ever go and then check that
No.
depth against that? You don't
No.
care if they're not equal?
They should visually look equal. My guess is this isn't perfectly square. Even though you tore it and blocked it and stuff, it's going to be square to by eye, but it's not going to be square to the 1/8 of an
Okay,
inch.
so we don't worry if it's down 1/8 of an inch or...
No, because if it's off, like if I measured this right now, I know this is square because I did my ruler trick,
Yeah.
right? If I measured this right now, I'm like 8 inches there and 8 and a little bit more over there, and it's just
Okay.
my fabric edges are kind of wavy.
Okay.
That's why we're going from a folded edge
Okay.
as our standard line to start from rather than these wavy, torn, rough edges. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing on my back. From the top edge, I'm going to measure down 1 1/4 inches. That's going to be where my center back waist intersection is. Mark what that is. Especially if you don't know what these markings are yet, label all of them, right? My back hip depth. What is my back hip depth? Ah, okay, this is good. This is another thing. Before we start, we need to check. Are your tapes, you guys all figured out where the widest part of your form is, great. But are your tapes loose and floppy? Okay? If they're loose and floppy, like mine are really loose and floppy right now, fix them now. Fix them at the beginning of the semester. Don't find out in 3 or 4 weeks that your tape is slipping all over the place. We want to make sure that this tape that you've put in, that we're going to use as a guideline, is stable and doesn't move and is staying straight. So do you see I don't even have a pin at my side seam? I want a pin at my side seam, at my princess seams, at every single seam, and even some in between. I like to put them every 2 inches or so, every 1.5 or 2 inches. Nothing worse than doing all this work, and maybe you did your work really, really well, and then we go to do the fitting, and nothing matches the tapes because your tapes moved, right? So now, before we start any projects, make sure that nothing has moved. We're going to be leaving this hip tape on the entire term. We're going to be leaving the waist tape on the entire term. The only thing that will be coming off at some point is the bust bridge. And why would these get loose?
She lost weight on
She lost weight. She's been
her
working out.
holiday. She
No,
wasn't eating.
you know, you put stuff on, you take stuff off, you put stuff on, you take stuff off constantly on here. And stuff shifts. They're also shared forms. We're lucky this term that we don't have to share these forms with anybody. So stuff isn't going to disappear on you. Honestly, if you're halfway through a drape, leave your drape on the form, which normally during the semester is a big no-no. But yeah, you're going to be using your form exclusively. So that's kind of cool. All right, now that my hip tape has changed, especially in the back, if you do change your tapes, that means your measurements on page 17 have changed, right? So I'm going to find out what my new hip depth is. So I'm now 7 1/4 in the back. So from that 1 1/4 inch mark, I'm going to measure down for my hip depth. put a mark. Back hip depth, I'm going to write down what that measurement is. If I have it here and on page 17 and on here, I'm more likely to be accurate, right? So I'm going to square my line across. And that guy really changed. Okay, and you can visually see one looks kind of angled, right? So we want to go with the one that's squared. And these little kind of box shapes I'm making, that's my symbol for making sure it's squared off there. If you see a project come back to you that has little squares there, that means you didn't do that. Okay, so we're going to make sure it's squared there. I'm going to label this line. This is, I write HBL for short. Does anyone know what HBL means? Horizontal balance line, but it's a whole lot easier for me to write HBL. Okay? Now, we need to know what our hip arc measurements are. Well, I know my front hip arc is 8 3/4. So from that center front fold, I'm going to measure on my HBL line my 8 3/4 measurement. Now, if you're not super comfortable with the ruler or measuring, I've got some cheat sheets you could use. We're going to be accurate to the 1/16 of an inch in this class. So if you're not even sure where 1/16 of an inch on your ruler is, then we're going to definitely come to me. I'd like to explain that now at the beginning of the semester rather than find out at week 15 that you're still not sure how to read the ruler. Don't be embarrassed if you don't know how to read the ruler. A lot of you might have actually not even grown up with inches. Maybe you're centimeter people. So I'm happy to introduce you to how this works. Okay, so I've measured over my 8 3/4, and again, these are my notes, so I'm going to write along here my front hip arc is 8 3/4. So I'm going to be looking for these markings. I'm going to be looking to see if you've put your measurements on here. It'll also let me know that you've double checked it. Okay? So this 8 3/4, this is what it would be if this skirt were skin tight. Okay? But we're not going to make a skin tight skirt. We're going to make a skirt that has some room in here so that she can sit down and she can walk. Like I'm wearing a pretty slim skirt today, but I can still pinch a 1/2 inch on either side of my hip. That's going to be our goal, is to be able to pinch a 1/2 inch on each side so that she can sit down, she can eat dinner and not feel like she can't walk anymore or whatever. We're going to be putting an inch, or a 1/2 inch on each side of the skirt. And we're going to put that in now. Okay? What's going to happen is once this muslin is accurately marked, the skirt is actually halfway done before we even put it up on the form. Okay? So we're going to measure an additional 1/2 inch beyond this hip arc measurement. So this is my hip arc. This is if the skirt were skin tight. I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch beyond that and put a second mark. And that 1/2 inch, we're going to be calling that ease. Okay, we're going to be talking a lot about ease this term. We're not going to be making skin tight stuff. This stuff is going to be clothing that can actually be worn comfortably. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing in the back using my back measurements. Okay, so I've got my hip arc in the back. It's 9 inches. I'm going to put a 1/2 inch of ease there also. Okay. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to draw our side seam in. Okay, right now while it's flat on the table, we're going to draw it in. And then all we're going to need to find on the form is where our darts and waistline and curved hip live. Okay, but from the HBL down, our skirt's going to be done before we even start it on the form. So our side seam is going to be parallel to the center back and to the center front all the way down. Okay, So if I want to draw a side seam line that's parallel, what do you think the best way for me to do it is?